In 12.2 we now have a stitch item, which is a utility for quickly applying stitching to a surface. But its uses aren't restricted solely to stitches. It can be used in any situation where you want to apply an object multiple times along a curve based on another surface. The stitch item can be found either in the geometry menu or in the new Modo layout. And when you run it, you're asked to define both the stitch you want to use and also how you want to define the curve. By default, it'll want to use a stitch preset. If you decheck that, it'll want to use an assembly. We'll get onto those in a minute. But if you decheck that, it'll allow you to pick any item that's already in the scene, so you don't have to use a stitch. So next it asks you how you want to define the curve. A new mesh is the manual method of defining the curve on a surface, and it defaults to Bezier, but you can choose curve if you want to. So hit OK and it'll bring up a preset browser and you can choose a stitch preset that you want to use. Select it and hit OK again. So now you can click and drag on a surface in the viewport. The curve will be created and you can draw out your stitches. To create multiple curves, just hold down Shift and click and drag, and you can create another curve. But there are other ways of creating the curve. So say you've modelled your mesh where you have an edge exactly where you want the stitches to be placed. In this example, at the bottom of this trench. So all you need to do is select the edge, run the stitch mesh setup. Instead of using new mesh, you can choose either selected edges unlinked, which will just create a new curve on the surface, or selected edges procedural, in which case it'll create a procedural curve which is stuck to the surface. So I'm going to use procedural curve. Hit OK, choose your stitch, let's choose the 2mm one, hit OK, and the stitches will be applied. Now the great thing about this, with the procedural method, is that if I select this mesh and run something like element move, I can adjust that mesh and the stitches will follow it. So the other way of doing it is by having curves that already exist in the scene. So in this mesh layer, I've already got some curves that I've defined. So if I run the stitch mesh setup, choose existing mesh, and then choose that mesh item, hit OK, select my stitch, OK again, and the stitches will be applied. So when you run the stitch item setup, it creates this stitch item in the scene, which has various properties. So under setup, it defines the curve in the scene that's being used, the mesh that the stitches are being aligned to, and also the stitch preset that's being used. But you can change these at any time. You can also change the stitch preset that's being used. So if you click that, you can swap to a different preset, hit OK, and the stitch will be changed. Let's go back. And you can also freeze the stitches. So if you want to export stitches as actual geometry, then you can hit freeze stitches and it will create a mesh item with the stitches inside. So the stitches are now exportable geometry, but it doesn't remove the stitch item. You can then choose from various placement modes, but it defaults to the actual size of the stitch. You can then also offset the stitch from the surface if you need to. And you can also adjust the gap between the stitches if you want. So if I just reduce that, you can see it makes them a little bit closer together. You can also add variation to the placement of the stitch, but you'll probably want to use quite small values in this situation. So let's add 5 degrees of rotation to the stitch, and you can see getting slight variation there. You can also add holes for the stitches, and these can only be seen at render time, so just bring up preview here. So if I click add stitch hole texture, you'll see the holes appear. Now it defaults to a bump map, but you can have it as a diffuse map or a displacement. And when it gets added, the texture gets placed at the top of the shader tree. So it also gives you the option to place it into a particular material mask. And you also have options for the opacity of that texture and the actual size of the hole. But stitching can be much more complicated than just a single line of stitches. So you have variants you can choose from. So if you click Add Double Stitching, it'll give you 2 rows of stitches with options to create 3 if you want, or to change the distance between those, or just have stitching on one side or the other. You can have cross stitching with options for how they cross and also the angle. You can have V-stitching with options to change the angle again. And you can also have baseball stitch with their options for the angle of the stitch and how close they are together. So where things really get interesting is the stitch items can be rigged. So by using a combination of multiple stitch items, you can create very complex stitches. And this is where Assemblies comes in. So here I'm just going to select an edge loop. I'm going to run the setup again, and instead of using a preset, I'm going to use an assembly. And I'm going to use a procedural edge. So hit OK. And we've provided 3 examples for you. So if I click triple stitch, hit OK. See, it applies the stitch to the surface, and this is a combination of 2 stitches with different size stitch presets. And it also has some controls. So if I go to assembly channels here, see I can change the width of that stitch pretty easily. So let's try a different one. So I'll select this edge loop, stitch item setup, use assembly and procedural curve. This time I'm going to choose the wave stitch. That'll get applied, and this has other various controls exposed. So we can change the spacing, we can offset various stitches to make it asymmetrical, scale them. So we've got complete control over this stitch to the point where we're almost designing a stitch. And finally, if I make another selection, we have flat lock. And again, this has got controls, so we can change the size of that stitch. So with the rigging skills, you can potentially create any stitch you can think of. And if you want to investigate how these stitches were created, then if you just go into the schematic and into the assemblies, you can read about how they were made.